The UK government has until Thursday to decide if it wants to block Scotland's new gender recognition law, which drew shouts of shame when it was passed at Holyrood. The FT says the government is going to block that legislation.
Yes, in Scotland, this would allow children as young as 16 to change their gender. They would not need medical diagnosis to do so. Labour's Keir Starmer says 16 is too young.
I have concerns about the provision in Scotland, in particular the age reduction to 16, in particular the rejection of our amendment in relation to the Equalities Act.
So you would not agree that you are old enough at the age of 16?
No, I don't think you are.
To discuss this, we're now joined by journalist Helen Joyce, who's written about these trans issues, who agrees with the Labour leader that 16 is too young, and Britain's first transgender newsreader, India Willoughby, who believes 16 is not too young to make a decision on gender. And just to start with you, India, because, of course, you have kind of lived and experienced this transition. So if you don't mind me asking, at what age do you think you knew that you needed to make that change?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on. It was certainly before junior school, Ed. And if you actually look it up, this might surprise some people actually listening, but all of us, you, Susanna, Helen, everybody, we all become aware of our gender identity by the age of 3. And trans people are no different. How I would describe it, it's very difficult actually getting across, obviously, what it feels like to be trans compared to somebody who isn't, because unless you are, you don't know. But the only analogy I can give you is that for 99.9% of the population, it's like drinking water, and water doesn't have a taste, so you don't actually notice it. But if you drink water and it's slightly off, you're aware of it straight away. And I was certainly aware of it before I started junior school. And when I think back, I can't remember a single day of my life until I actually transitioned and everything went away, when it wasn't the first thing on my mind in the morning and the last thing at night.
So for you, it was really kind of clear from your earliest memory. Do you think you would feel differently if you were talking to, a friend or giving advice to somebody if they were, for the first time, considering that decision in a real way when they were 14 or 15? Would that concern you more than in your case when it was clear from the earliest memory?
Well, all stories are different, and everyone has a different experience. And as I said there, I can't speak for other people, and I can't put myself in their shoes. But if you actually look at the history of trans people who have existed in every culture, in every century that we have on record, the experience is the same. People tend to know at a very young age. The issue is that it's such a confusing time earlier on in terms of you don't have the vocabulary to actually articulate how you feel. And because we have historically lived in a world where trans has been extremely taboo and seen as some sort of perversion and weird and sickness, people have been reluctant to talk about it. But we see with the gay population, just the last year or so, we've had figures from the Office of National Statistics showing that the gay population has actually doubled since 2014. And that is largely down to the fact that people are more confident speaking up and coming out.
Look, the current legislation in the UK is that people apply to a UK gender recognition panel. They must typically present a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, described by the NHS as a mismatch between their biological sex, whether they're born physically male or female, and their gender identity. Applicants need to provide 2 medical reports, and they must also have lived full-time in their required gender for at least 2 years. The Scottish Government says that is too difficult, it's invasive, it causes distress. This is a group of already marginalised and vulnerable people. So in Scotland, that would be brought down to 16. If you're 16, you need to have lived in that acquired gender for 6 months, but all others, the limit would be brought down from 2 years of living in your gender down to 3.
Weeks.
Yeah.
Months.
3 months. Helen Joyce, is 16 the right age to make that decision?
I don't think it is. And I have to say I take issue with quite a few of the things that India said. Every single research study ever done on children, prepubescent children who feel strongly that they were meant to be the opposite sex, shows that in puberty, almost all of them change their minds. And what you have to understand is that this legislation isn't really about recognising gender. It's about recategorising people as members of the opposite sex. That's what the Gender Recognition Act does. It changes your sex for legal purposes. Of course, it's not possible to do that physically. So if you change 16-year-olds' legal sex, and remember, these are people who have not undergone any surgery, are highly unlikely to have had even hormones, they haven't had a medical diagnosis, they're not under medical supervision. The Scottish government says that changing your name and asking people to call you by other pronouns is enough to show that you are living as the opposite sex. These are people who are in school. And in schools, you have to think about safeguarding, you have to think about who uses which facilities, you have to think about away trips. And now you've got people who are actually of one sex and who are clearly of one sex. You can see that they are, but everybody has to categorise them as members of the other sex. So I have a lot of issues with the whole framework around what's called gender recognition, but I have a major issue with it happening in schools because it messes up safeguarding. Everybody has to be clear about sex.
OK. Helen Joyce, can I ask, because people watching will then wonder if you're at a single-sex school and you change your gender at 16, do you stay at that single-sex school in the other gender, or would you have to then go to a different single-sex school and vice versa? Do we know what happens under the legislation?
You ask an excellent question, and it's just one of about 150 things that have come up to do with this row between Scotland and the UK government. The way the Scottish government has done this is to amend one part of the UK-wide legislation, the Gender Recognition Act. And there are literally about 100 questions about what it does to single-sex spaces, to schools, to single-sex admissions, to equal pay, all of those sorts of things. And the answers aren't there because the Scottish government really didn't do the work that it needed to do beforehand to make sure that it was keeping within the bounds of devolution.
But the point is, but the point is, at the moment, the school issue doesn't arise because across the UK, you can't start your transition until you're 18, and you have to have a 2-year period of living in the changed gender before you can change your legal status. And so we haven't had to deal with this before in schools, whereas in Scotland now, the law would say that your legal sex changes at 16. So if you were a head teacher, what would you be planning right now to do in Scotland to deal with such a case?
We literally don't know how this new legislation interacts with the Equality Act, in which gender reassignment and sex are separate protected characteristics. If I were a head teacher, I would be expecting legal action no matter what I did. And that's really very unfair. OK,
India, let's take that specific example. If you're a boy at a single-sex boys' school, but you feel very uncomfortable, you do choose to change your gender, do you stay at the school as a girl, or do you then go to the girls' school? What do you understand would happen in that circumstance at 16?
Well, the circumstance should be that you stay at the school. Simple as that. You know, we're not in the business of segregating people and being discriminatory. You know, we've actually moved on from this.
No, but we do have single-sex schools, don't we? So I just can imagine people think, well, if you're a boy who, you believe you were born into the wrong body and you're actually, and you change gender to be a girl, then you would then expect to be at a girls' school, would you not?
You would, absolutely. That's what I'm saying. But I'd just like to come back to what Helen was saying there,
So you imagine that sorry, just to establish, you imagine then the situation would be that at 16, if you changed your gender, then you go from the boys' single-sex school to the girls' single-sex school because you are now legally a girl. OK.
Absolutely, because we recognise trans people. I know Helen's not happy about that, but we do. And just to clarify, I know we're talking about gender and sex, and it's become a kind of interchangeable word where, you know, one means the same thing. Just to be clear, that under the Gender Recognition Act and the gender reforms, you actually change
Just be careful
sex.
holding your passport up for...
Okay.
Sorry, we don't want anybody to get your passport
But the
details.
point is, your passport says your sex is female.
But yeah, you change your legal sex. That's what happens when you go through the Gender Recognition Act. But what I would say is, you know, this myth that we're probably going to talk about in a minute, that people are going to abuse this system and identify for nefarious reasons a predator pretending to be trans in order to get close to women or girls is just preposterous. There isn't a single case anywhere in the world. There are now 20 plus countries with over 380 million people living in them. And there isn't a single case anywhere of somebody who isn't trans, pretending to be trans, going through the system, updating their birth certificate in order to attack somebody. What are they going to do with a document? It doesn't actually give them an advantage. It doesn't actually save them for prosecution. You know, the idea that trans people or people pretending to be trans are going to cause an issue through this is just preposterous.
All right,
Can
India
I respond to that?
Yes,
because
of course,
I'm from
yes.
one of those countries.
Yep. Go ahead, Helen.
I'm from Ireland, and we have gender self-ID in Ireland. We introduced it in 2015. Any man can get legal status as a woman by paying £5 and filling in a form online. And since then, we have had 3 men identify as women after being charged with violent and sexual crimes against women, and then now they're held in women's jails. And that includes men who have committed really vile sex crimes, have threatened to murder people, have, you know, attacked women. They are much stronger than women, and they are held in the women's jail, which makes the women's jail very difficult to run. The women are having to spend time in lockdown in their cells, and that is because of self-ID. Okay. It is because they got birth certificates saying they're female, and that gave them the right to be held in women's jails. I don't think it's relevant whether they're pretending or not. OK. You know, we strayed slightly from the issue of lowering the age, but we appreciate both of your contributions. Thank you so much, Helen Joyce and India Willoughby.
Got to say,
Let us know what you think.
This is complicated for all the reasons we've discussed, but also, if this becomes the issue where you have a constitutional crisis, really, between the UK government and Westminster and the Scottish Parliament. I mean, yes. This is a tough issue to
for Rishi Sunak
to map
to
your
navigate.
constitution out over.